This is Sovereign Debt, a podcast on greening the global economy and debt sustainability. I'm your host, Jill Doshi. So hello, everyone. We've been talking a lot on this podcast about the Nature Conservancy's recent support of a debt for nature swap in Belize, which really has set the pace for transactions going forward, linking sovereign debt to climate and nature outcomes. But many of us remember that before there was Belize, there was the Seychelles. And today we are super excited to have Jean-Paul Adam, former Minister of Finance of Seychelles, and now Director of Technology, Climate Change, and Natural Resource Management of the United Nations Economic Council for Africa, or UNECA. So thank you, Jean-Paul, for joining us here today.
Thanks, Jill. It's great to be here. And I'm sorry that in the UN we've got such long titles. I'm going to be really happy to talk about my past experience and what we're doing going forward.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, it sounds like you have quite the portfolio of UNECA. So we will get into that.
In the current context, as in fact a few of my colleagues have said, we are essentially the directorate for everything because everything's going through climate right now. And I would say logically so.
Right. So, but before we get to the UNECA portfolio, I want to dial back a few years, back to, I think it was 2015, when Seychelles really was breaking new ground in its debt for nature swap. That was a huge success in terms of conservation. I think it was 30% of your ocean footprint, if I can call it that, of Seychelles was put under protection. The deal, like Belize, was supported by the Nature Conservancy. However, it was a very different transaction since it was swapping debt that was owed to the Paris Club creditors and did not involve commercial creditors or bonds. Can you walk us through that transaction?
Sure. I mean, it was a very exciting process to be involved in, and perhaps just to highlight that I started being involved in that first as the foreign minister, so I wasn't the finance minister, when we started the conversation with the Nature Conservancy. And at that point, it was really just an idea. And the idea was recognizing that Seychelles had gone through a very bad experience after the financial crash of 2008. The country had essentially defaulted on its debt in 2008 and was actually bouncing back very effectively around 2010, 2011 when we started the conversations with the TNC. But had very little access to capital. And essentially, there were different reasons for that. Partly, Seychelles had graduated to become not only middle income, but a high income country. And that meant not able to access the typical developing country finance, such as IDA, which is under the World Bank, and even organizations such as the European Union, or even USAID would consider Seychelles as not a priority country for support. And so while the economic fundamentals were improving, there was no spare money to invest in new things. And for a long time, Seychelles had prided itself on being a conservation leader. 50% of the land territory had been put under conservation a few years before. And the next logical phase was to look at protecting the marine area, which was much, much larger. Seychelles covers 1.3 million square kilometers. It has less than 100,000 people, but to put that in perspective, that's 3 times the size of Germany, right? Wow. So it's a very big oceanic space. And wanting to protect that was challenging in an environment where you have no additional flows of finance. And you've essentially reorganized your debt, but there's no flows. There's very limited additional flows that you can invest in new things. And that's where the debt swap was really interesting because it could create a new flow of finance. And particularly going to something that was identified as a priority. And a priority not only from the perspective of the conservation impacts, but the link that it had with Seychelles tourism brand, which was one of barefoot luxury, associated with a pristine environment, and so there were a lot of there was a lot of value, I would say, in the idea. The big difference, particularly with the Belize deal, is that Seychelles, at the point that we actually went to do the debt swap in 2015, was not in debt distress. Or, Belize, the euro bonds were trading on cents on the dollar because of a feeling that it was unviable, and that essentially meant that the debt buyback could be done relatively cheaply because the people holding the debt felt that they could get a good deal by selling even less than they perhaps had originally anticipated. In the context of Seychelles, it was different because the default that happened in 2008 had triggered a first debt restructuring that had already taken place. And even at that point, that debt restructuring was finalized in 2010. And when that debt restructuring was done, Seychelles had been given a haircut at that point. So essentially, when Seychelles went for its actual debt swap 5 years later in 2015, it was in a very stable situation. The fiscal surplus was above 5% of GDP. Debt was being paid on time. Debt had been reduced dramatically. And the goal of the debt swap was simply to get some fiscal space and finance this environmental investment. So the circumstances were different. And because Seychelles had already had, as the Paris Club put it, a bite of the cherry in 2010, the second bite was going to be less consequential, meaning there would be less haircuts. And the only way that concessionality could be achieved would be by the Nature Conservancy agreeing to essentially take a lower return. So essentially, we swapped higher priced debt, which was averaging at above 7% on average, for lower priced debt, which was restructured at around 3%. And the difference in what was being paid in interest was then committed to be invested in the creation of the marine protected area. So the sums were small because we were essentially dealing with a small amount of debtors that were willing to participate because they didn't feel obligated or that it was that they had any financial incentive to participate. And so it was essentially, I would say, political will of the creditors wanting to participate. Of course, they didn't lose because the debt was bought back. Well, apart from in the future, but in the immediate, they didn't. They got a payment up front.
But it wasn't bought back at a significant discount.
It was bought back at less than, I think it was about 5% discount, and that discount was achieved purely through the support of France. Basically, one of the creditors agreed to give a bit more and to create an overall concessionality. But the discount was minimal, and the main saving was achieved through the support of the Nature Conservancy. Okay. But why was this still, even though the amount was small, why was it still interesting for Seychelles? Because it did create that new flow of finance which wasn't there before, and regular and dependable, and money that was earmarked specifically for marine conservation. And it met a lot of those. It wasn't enough to pay for the whole marine spatial plan, but it was a sizable component, and it created, as I said, that predictability of flows. The advantage from the perspective of the fiscal situation was, in terms of the balance of payments, it was not inconsequential because also the debt was converted into local currency. So all of the debt repayment was then moved into local currency. So even though the overall amount was relatively small, you've got to keep in mind this is a country of less than 100,000 people. And when you're creating a flow, a regular flow of hundreds of thousands of dollars going into the environment, and plus this is money that is no longer leaving the country in foreign exchange, it has actually a much more sizable benefit than you will see in the monetary sum. So, but I think the main big thing that it changed was creating that flow of predictable finance into marine conservation, which just wasn't there before.
I mean, that's fascinating. So from a debt, sustainability perspective, it wasn't really a huge impact. Although, like you said, it converted it into local currency. So, like, in other words, the obligation of the state to continue to shell out money was still there, but it was now earmarked for conservation rather than, as you say, leaving the country. And the terms were a little bit more advantageous because it was in local currency and being reinvested in the economy.
That's right. And the other aspect, I think that's because I should stress Seychelles was not in debt distress. And if we had gone to do the debt swap in 2008, right. I mean, timing was not aligned. We would have probably been able to do, probably close to $400 million worth or so, because that was what we restructured in 2010. So and that would have been hugely interesting. The reality was that we weren't ready at that point. We hadn't had the conversations with the Nature Conservancy, and the other aspect, which is, I think, very important to keep in mind, is that we had always wanted to generate these funds going into marine conservation. So it was something that was planned, and then it was a question of trying to find how to finance it. And what we eventually got in terms of the flow of funds was only a portion of what we needed, but it created a momentum. So, for example, the debt swap was a direct precursor to then eventually issuing a blue bond.
Interesting.
It reasserted Seychelles both conservation bona fides, but also it created awareness of Seychelles as well in the market, and people who were involved in that sustainable finance space. It made people sit up and they saw, oh, this has happened. That's interesting. And we'd immediately, when we concluded the debt swap, we'd started the conversation with the World Bank about a blue bond. And the interest was I would say, continuous from that. And we also attracted benefactors, other philanthropists that were also interested in supporting the process. And the whole process that was associated with the creation of the marine protected area, which has been done now, it's in place. It's a marine protected area of over 400,000 square kilometers. It's the second largest in the Indian Ocean. I think it's in the top 5 largest in the world. So it's a very big marine protected area, and there's a flow of resources which is for 20 years locked in, supporting that process. Even if it's not 100% of the budget for that marine protected area, it's a anchor finance which has, I would say, acted as a magnet to bring in other financing.
And I think that's a really important point, because sometimes people criticize the Seychelles deal by saying, oh, it was so small. And like you said, there wasn't a very big discount, or it didn't have as big impact on the debt picture of Seychelles. But from a conservation perspective, it was enormous. And like you said, creating that momentum and creating a whole kind of governance around conservation and creating a narrative for future, investors and other transactions, it was important.
And I fully understand that criticism, because I think a lot of the people are looking at this deal primarily from the financials. And I would say the real goal is to look at it from the perspective of what we wanted to achieve in the first place. And what we wanted to achieve was a marine protected area. And then there's the question of whether you do it, whether you try to, and then there's different ways that you can try and finance it. Some countries try to finance it through a tax on airline tickets and so on. Because we're a tourism destination, that really wasn't viable. We knew that we'd have a lot of challenges in terms of implementing something like that. And the goal was to create a marine protected area and to create a flow of income that would make that possible, and that's been achieved. So I think we've got to go back to what I think if you're doing a debt swap purely for the fiscal reasons, and there are very good fiscal reasons, and certainly in Seychelles, the balance of payments advantage was not inconsequential. Right. It was actually very meaningful, because it's a small country. and a change in flows of just a few $100,000 actually has impact. So the fiscal benefits and the balance of payments benefits were certainly part of it, but the main goal, it all started with the goal of marine conservation. And from that perspective, I think it would always be great if we were able to do for more money. But ultimately, Seychelles had already done a debt restructuring. So a lot of the typical fiscal arguments, and for example, what Belize was able to do, Seychelles was not able to bring to the table. But what I think is positive as well is that debt swaps, therefore, are not only for those who are in debt distress. And I think that's very important going forward, because there are some countries that I know of that are interested in the debt swap, but they're worried about what perception this brings to the market. And what we saw in the Seychelles case, that less than 6 months after the debt swap, we were actually upgraded in terms of the rating agency. It was Fitch that did the rating at that time. And they actually gave Seychelles an upgrade, not purely on the basis of the debt swap, because it was a small transaction, but they did recognize that balance of payment issues were one of the biggest risks for the country because of the lack of diversification. And therefore, any advantage that you gained on the balance of payments was very
meaningful,
was very important and meaningful. Yes.
Interesting. So, I mean, I think you've highlighted some very important reasons why we need to continue to look at the Seychelles deal and look at for these precedents and see how we can replicate it in other places for either countries that are in debt distress or otherwise, like you say. And that kind of leads me to my next question, because you and I collaborated on a recent publication that was a how-to guide for sovereign debt managers of how to link financial transactions for sovereigns to climate and nature outcomes. And we tried to distill, somewhat based on your experience, but tried to distill this very complicated process into what we came down to as 7 clear steps. And we don't have to go into each step, but I would like to kind of pick your brain and ask you to give some advice to those debt managers who are thinking of such transactions. And like you said, where do you begin and how do you start this? What are the first steps for countries, like you say, whether they're in debt distress or otherwise, that are thinking this might be a really good way, as you say, to kind of meet our conservation goals and address kind of climate and nature challenges, as well as perhaps helping the debt picture?
I always, and I've spoken to quite a few people about this, obviously. I think it's always good to start not with the debt question, but the question of what you as a country want to do. What's the missing link? What's the achievement that you want to achieve, and where is there a gap in terms of funding that you really feel you need to address, and that's difficult to meet in terms of your current fiscal situation. And there are a lot of countries that face these issues. So there are even countries that are technically relatively well off, but what they find in terms of their fiscal revenues, they're all locked in. Portions are locked into pensions. Large civil services, teachers, army, police, you name it, right? A lot of the time, revenues may even be growing, but they're locked into expenses that are very difficult to change in terms of budgets. And most finance ministers know that your first challenge is that you need to match what's coming in with what you're spending. And sometimes you do have to cut spending. And when you have to cut spending, it's very, very hard, particularly if it's programs that have existed for years and years. And often, if it involves layoffs, and it's very, very complicated. And usually the environment and conservation is low down in terms of the list of priorities for new finance. Right. And this is why I think conservation type projects are particularly well suited for debt swaps, but they are not exclusively. We're currently also working with Jordan that potentially want to do one on water, for example. Mm-hmm. And I think that makes a lot of sense as well. But I do think the first guidance always is start with what you want and what you feel is currently missing and what you would like to fund. And then I think the other key messages from the debt swap, from the paper that we've shared and the guide that we've shared is you really want to structure yourself nationally. You want to make sure that there is appropriate buy-in from all the partners. You need ministers of finance, ministers of environment, and in many cases other ministries as well to be on board. You need to make sure that there's a full understanding that everybody is speaking from the same same set of notes, and that everyone is clear on what needs to be achieved. And it's once you've got all of that in place, identifying what are the indicators, what are the marks of success for your transaction. And again, I would tend to focus on the goal should be, I mean, there will be fiscal benefits, but it's better to focus on the sustainability benefits first.
Mm-hmm.
And then the fiscal benefits, in a sense, flow from that. And what we've seen also in the Seychelles example is that there has been, as with the marine protected area, you've seen increases in, for example, marine-based tourism. There's a lot more focus on that in terms of the marketing. There's even in terms of fishing, it's led to specific projects around management of stocks, focusing on future yields, and looking at the issue of pricing for fishing entrepreneurs, which is something which is obviously often a case of a lot of instability. And in the context of marine conservation, you can actually provide quite good and surprisingly good benefits also for fishing entrepreneurs, because often you can create more reliable sources of income. So I think that the key to the guide is you start with what you want. You have very good coordination locally. You're clear on the indicators, and that gives you the platform to then talk to creditors. And I think that's a sort of universal pathway. There will be slight differences for a country that's in debt distress. There's obviously a much more sense of urgency, and probably you can achieve more in terms of the financing. And therefore, also you might wish to have more than one area of intervention as well. And for countries that are not in debt distress, I think you can really do something that's bespoke. And of course, the risk is the high transaction costs in terms of time and so on, which certainly in the Seychelles case, because it hadn't been done before in the context of ocean conservation. And the engagement with the Paris Club was very substantial and time consuming. But what I see as one of the things that can really change is that we're now in a situation where the IMF is talking about it. The World Bank is talking about it. If we have a framework that simply says the debt swaps are absolutely viable form of, from two angles, a form of debt restructuring and a form of development finance, and then let countries that feel they're in a position to do so to have a pathway that's clear, then the cost will dramatically be reduced. The cost in terms of time and in terms of resources, and then it simply becomes part of your fiscal process, I would say.
I was going to ask another question while you were talking, but then I'm thinking that I want to skip to this one, which is, what is UNECA doing in this space, or even the UN kind of more broadly? I mean, is this something, when you're talking about these kind of global frameworks, is this something that the UN could be involved in or is looking at? And UNECA has been a really kind of a leading voice for the continent in this kind of pandemic era, if we can call it that, and it has really been kind of leading the charge of kind of innovations and new ideas and coordinating its member countries. Is this something that UNECA is interested in looking at? Absolutely, and because we can't deal with the response to the pandemic or to climate change if we don't deal with the issue of fiscal space, and if we don't deal with the issue of debt. In the context of this pandemic, African countries' debt has risen probably proportionally more than probably any other region. The debt was only just over about 50% of GDP pre-pandemic, but it was rising very fast, it has to be said, even before the pandemic, and it's shot up to well over 70% on average. And the problem in particular is those countries that are in debt distress, because those that are in debt distress in Africa have a very difficult situation where they are in debt distress, they have very limited diversification in their economies,
and they're often dependent on external aid or external flows of finance, remittances, and the like, which are severely affected in the context of the pandemic. So you've got this low growth, high debt, perfect storm, which is brewing.
And they're also the stewards of an enormous natural capital, right? When we're thinking of like the Congo Basin or
the Congo Basin, just the Congo Basin holds the equivalent of 3 years worth of global emissions.
Lord.
3 years worth of what the world emits in its entirety.
Wow.
And Africa currently, even though Africa has the highest rate of forest cover in all the continents, original forest cover, it also has the fastest rate of deforestation. And that's because of lack of access to energy. So you have a large number of people that depend on firewood and so forth, and also agricultural practices that are associated with that, and also the impact of climate change. So all of those mean that the rate of deforestation in Africa is very, very fast. And the problem is that peatlands such as the Congo, the second largest carbon sink in the world after the Amazon, if you have a rate of deforestation which is too fast, then it turns from a carbon sink to a carbon emitter. And all of that carbon that is stored starts to be emitted. And then you actually have an acceleration of climate change, which is even worse. So the urgency of having nature-based solutions that are financed in Africa is actually very, very important. And the good news as well is that when done right, and I would cite the Seychelles example, it creates jobs, it creates livelihoods. It's linked to other opportunities for sustainable finance that will that are linked to that.
Because it's also based into the local communities, right? And you're creating jobs, and there's a huge social. I mean, we're talking about climate and nature, but what I think we have to be careful and make sure that we constantly highlight is the human element in all of this too, is that once we address the conservation, we're addressing indigenous people, we're in local communities, as you were talking about the entrepreneurs of fishing or the farmers, it's really a social impact as well.
Exactly. And there's a lot of opportunities to create employment and livelihood opportunities around these high biodiversity areas. You can do climate smart agriculture in buffer areas around pristine forest. And there are some good examples actually being done in Africa, but which need to be upscaled. And this is precisely this kind of activity. And you've got examples in countries like Senegal where they're replanting mangroves. They're already doing this, even with a very, very limited financing. And when you replant mangroves, you get a double benefit. You create protection against erosion from the sea, but you also create habitats for fish reproduction. And so you directly link to future yields for fishing communities in those areas. So there's a virtuous circle that can be very easily built by investing in these areas. The big problem African countries have is the flow of resources into these areas, which currently is very limited. Quite often it's dependent on NGOs, essentially, that often that have very limited funds. And the resources are not predictable. So you may have mangrove planting that happens for a season, but then those resources dry up, and then it's difficult to sustain it in the longer term. And that's one of the big advantages of the Seychelles debt swap. You've got certain resources allocated, guaranteed for 20 years into this whole process. The same with Belize. By doing this arrangement, they've locked in resources to fund one of the areas which initially does not look, for some economists, you might say, well, this is not contributing to GDP, but actually it's one of the biggest contributors to GDP. And natural capital accounting shows that. So I think really that, so to go back to what UNECA is doing, sorry, I went a little bit on a tangent. We are actively supporting a few countries in West Africa that are interested. We're working with Cabo Verde, that are actually in quite an advanced position in terms of discussing a debt swap with their creditors. They've got clear ideas on what they want to do around around the blue economy and protecting their oceanic space and linking that again with the tourism industry. We're working with Senegal if we go back to Cabo Verde, they are precisely in a situation where they have high debt, over 100% of debt to GDP ratio. And again, they are middle income and struggling to get additional finance. And the Prime Minister of Cabo Verde put it extremely well in Glasgow, where he said, we can't borrow anymore because we've reached the ceiling in terms of borrowing. We get very limited grants because of our GDP per capita ratio. Mm-hmm. And we have very limited diversification in the local economy, which is essentially based around tourism, which is extremely affected by the pandemic.
Exactly.
So if we don't deal with this issue of debt, what we're saying is we're not going to develop or invest in anything for a number of years because there's no additional revenue to be invested anywhere. And so unless you find an innovative solution for this debt, you're essentially pressing pause or worse, going into reverse. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a number of countries in Africa are faced with this dilemma. And this is why quite a few countries at COP26 spoke about it. And UNECA, we want to help them specifically, work with them in terms of how they might create the offer in terms of a debt swap vis-a-vis their creditors. A few countries that mentioned this in the past, to Ghana, Namibia as examples. And we look forward to be able to working with them around how they could potentially do a debt swap. I think what we really need as well is a clear signal from the multilateral development finance institutions to say that this is on the table. It's not necessarily something that's right for every country, but it is a solution which I would say takes some countries out of this development limbo. So you've got countries like Cabo Verde. They were doing well before the pandemic. They are highly vulnerable because of the lack of diversification. So they don't have a million flows of income. Mm-hmm. But they were essentially bankable before this.
Right.
Then, but with a high debt, and by doing this, you can actually, even by creating a little bit of space, even 25%, let's say, a reduction in debt, you can create a huge impact in terms of where those flows of investment can go. Particularly linking it with the tourism sector, investing in conservation, but with ramifications and impacts across the tourism sector.
No, absolutely, and I think we do need that leadership from the global institutions, whether it's the UN, World Bank, IMF, etc. Of just really providing also capacity building and support, and hopefully also helping the sponsors of these transactions to go forward. So I'm conscious of our time, but I want to give you the last word. Is there anything else that you want to warn debt managers about? Any pitfalls that you experienced that you would say, kind of here's a red flag, beware of this, or any other last words of wisdom for either debt managers in Africa or even more broadly, any country that is feeling vulnerable to climate change?
I think when you start with a clear idea of what you want to achieve, and you're clear on where you want to invest, then that helps the process. Most of the conversations we had around the debt swap were about conservation. Mm-hmm. And that's something that even the most hardened banker struggles to come up with arguments to say no to. And so the narrative around what you want to do, if it's about investing in conservation, if it's about investing in access to water, access to affordable healthcare, these are narratives which ultimately will drive the success. If it's well designed in terms of what you're trying to achieve, then you then also have the options to look at the different ways. So for some countries, if you're not in debt distress, you might have the opportunity to issue a sustainability bond, a green bond, a blue bond. You may not wish to do it through a debt operation. And certainly in the conversations we're having with African countries, there are some countries that are saying, well, this could be a way to be our first transaction in the sovereigns market. And I think that makes a lot of sense. So I think the main advice I would give is to really focus on where are the gaps in terms of where you want to invest, what are the multiplier effects that this brings into your economy, and that then logically allows you to identify your performance indicators. And then I would say the fiscal benefits flow almost automatically from there, and you get a number of benefits. You get in many cases you might be able to get this big debt reduction, as was the case of Belize, and in all scenarios, if done well, you get a huge balance of payments boost. So start with what you want. Start with what makes the difference.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jean-Paul. I really appreciate you taking the time, and I look forward to working with you on implementing some of these deals. Let's get to work.
Absolutely, Joe.
Thank you for listening. We'll be off for the next 2 weeks to celebrate the holidays, but we'll be back in the new year with more episodes. If you enjoyed this episode, leave us a review and subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. Happy holidays!